Everyone, we might make a start. Whenever you're ready. Okay. Welcome to tonight's first XSAC. My name is Mark Evans, as you probably know, and I'm talking this evening about the ANZACs, or Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, legend or myth. Zach, if you would. Now, I'm sure we're all, by this point, quite aware of more or less what the ANZAC was. The Australian and New Zealand Army Corps was formed in November 1914. You can jump on to the next one again if you like. As a British Empire initiative to create a combined force of Australian and New Zealand troops to serve in Europe and in the Middle East. It was formed from the 1st Australian Imperial Force and the 1st New Zealand Expeditionary Force. The idea of the ANZAC was that these two forces, consisting of more or less, or after, I think it was by 1916, I don't quite remember, 6 divisions of troops, as well as 2 mounted divisions of Australian soldiers who worked separately, was to create a single, coordinated and effective force. The reality of that is perhaps slightly different, particularly at the beginning. For those of us who have seen the film Gallipoli, it provides very interesting discussion of the formation and early deployments of the Australian Imperial Force in particular, but of the ANZACs in general. And I will try not to bore you all too much with boring facts and figures and dates and, well, there's actually a lot about casualties, they're kind of important for the war. But where possible, we won't get bogged down in too much. Because the idea here is to discuss more than anything else the idea of ANZAC as opposed to the facts and figures of ANZAC. So, the film Gallipoli shows the beginning of the ANZAC story. Rural Australians recruited at uplifting polling stations telling you about doing your part for the war effort. Mates, people signing up together, going off to war in foreign places. They arrive in Egypt, where under Donnery English commanders they show off the true nature of their larrikin spirit. They mess around with the local Egyptians, they have fun, they run up the pyramids together as a sign of mateship. And the whole theme is building on this idea of the ANZAC legend. This is a very, very central part of Australian ideology. Depending on who you're talking to, questioning the idea of the ANZAC legend as anything but a factual discussion of Australia's military and political history is blasphemy. Plenty of people take it far more seriously than religion. And perhaps there's good reason. That's a little too fast. Taken from Wikipedia, the ANZAC spirit, or ANZAC legend, is a concept which suggests that Australian and New Zealand soldiers possess shared characteristics, including endurance, courage, ingenuity, good humour, larrikinism and mateship. I don't think I've ever heard an ANZAC Day address which didn't use at least 3/4 of those words just there. It is completely impossible to discuss Australia's contribution to the First World War, Australia's conflict in Gallipoli particularly, without referring to most or all of those words. It is something that is hammered into us again and again, and I would like this evening to discuss exactly how much most of those words actually impacted on the nature of the war itself. How many of these characteristics were truly shown by the average Australian soldier, who perhaps would have you believe was walking through the blasted battlescape with his mate across his shoulder, saving lives and smiting the foe wherever possible. If you will, Zach. The average Australian soldier was a well-trained but poorly equipped, highly specialised in many cases, and very, very, very ingenious man. He was well and truly capable of fighting his way out of the best of situations, but was inevitably led astray by his poor leadership. The great statement of lions led by donkeys that the soldiers of the Australian Imperial Force, as well as the British Empire themselves and the New Zealanders, were all corrupted or led into deadly situations by very poor leadership. People who believed in arbitrary strategy taken from the late 19th century would have rigid plans completely incapable of adjustment based on intelligence or common sense, would be completely uncaring to the requests or demands of their soldiers, and finally were hated by absolutely everyone. They would never leave their officers in the rear lines, and as the statement from Blackadder goes, the war was fought to move General Melchett's alcohol cabinet 2 inches closer to Berlin. if you will. Now, the Gallipoli campaign is central to the ideology of Australia by this point. Since particularly the 1990s, we've seen a massive resurgence in nationalism, in patriotism, and in, I would say, glorification of the Australian military. To the point where most of what I've just said doesn't even sound all that exaggerated. If it isn't already blatantly clear, and it certainly will be in about 5 minutes, most of what I've just said was massively exaggerated. The average Australian soldier, the idiocy of our generals, the reality of the conflict, were very, very dissimilar to anything I have just described. This lists the Australian and New Zealand and Ottoman casualties during the 8-month Gallipoli campaign running from April 26, 1915 to January 8, 1916. Australia suffers 8,709 dead, nearly 20,000 wounded. The New Zealanders suffered roughly 8,000 casualties, and the Ottoman Empire themselves suffered 57,000 dead, 107,000 wounded, and nearly 11,200 captured soldiers. Go ahead, Grisha.
Sorry, is that just the casualties for Gallipoli itself, or the entire Australian Ottoman War in the Middle East?
This is the Gallipoli campaigns.
What's the Brits and the French?
We'll get to those in a minute. These are the statistics that I see thrown around quite a lot, and I'm amazed by Australia's, or at least Australians' abilities to conveniently forget the existence of literally anyone else at the Gallipoli campaign. This would have you believe that our soldiers suffered vastly disproportionately small losses to the foe they were fighting, and it's a very interesting picture to paint, if you'll go ahead, Zach. Oh, by the way, if you've got any questions, you can jump back again about any of the pictures I'm showing, because I've included captions for most of them. I can tell you the story behind just about all of them. This picture obviously is taken from the final freeze, a very, very famous picture by now, of the movie Gallipoli, in which Archie, the protagonist at Gallipoli, at the Battle of the Neck in, I think it's September, I believe, 1915, somebody can check me on that, is forced over the front line in a completely poorly timed suicidal attack. The reality of the Neck was an absolute massacre. 600 Australian soldiers were killed or wounded in an area the size of a tennis court. The forces were forced to charge at extremely close range straight into Turkish machine guns by a poorly planned attack. It was a legitimate disaster. It was very similar to what we would believe every attack was like. A large number of things went very badly wrong, and perhaps worse still, the diversionary strike for the Battle of the Neck, a battle called Lone Pine, in which New Zealander forces were faced with a similar sort of circumstances. They succeeded incredibly. Took Lone Pine in what was meant to be a mere diversionary attack, and then were forced to abandon it when the Battle of the Neck failed, meaning that roughly 800 soldiers died that day for no gains whatsoever, if you will. There's the other casualties of the Gallipoli campaign, people we like to forget about. The United Kingdom had 34,000 soldiers killed, well more than the total number of Australian casualties. France had more soldiers killed than Australia did. I would be interested to know how many people here, and certainly how many people in the wider Australian community, even knew that there were French soldiers at Gallipoli. It's not actually all that commonly known, and you'd think, given how much we are supposed to learn about it, that we might know that. Their total casualties were slightly lower than Australia since they suffered less wounded. One of the main reasons for this is that the hospital ships that Allied forces provided for the Gallipoli campaign often prioritised English-speaking soldiers first, meaning that many French troops actually died awaiting some form of treatment. But as you can see, the massive number of British wounded and captured alone means that in any kind of common sense, this is actually far more a British battle than an Australian one. It is, of course, important for Australia, given we had a far lower number of soldiers at the war and a far lower total population, but we should never, and one of the greatest crimes in the historical discussion of the Gallipoli campaign is that, at least in wider Australian society, the contribution of so many other people to the campaign is completely forgotten, if you will. Now, of course, there's far, far more to a war than casualties. And there's certainly far, far more to the First World War than the casualties suffered by Australian forces at Gallipoli. Gallipoli was an 8-month-long campaign where, as we saw, roughly, I've already forgotten the number, 28,000 Australian soldiers were killed or captured. Sorry, killed or wounded, rather. The picture, as you can see here, is taken from the Battle of Fromelles. Sorry, that's a typo. This is actually 21st of July 1916. But these are... this is a picture from the Battle of Fromelles in the 21st of July 1916. It was Australia's first major action on the Western Front. In 48 hours, Australia suffered more dead than it did during the first 2 months of the Gallipoli campaign. But we forget about it, because it wasn't Gallipoli. Most people probably heard of the Battle of Mills. It's a nice start, I guess. The Australian 32nd Battalion, one of the battalions that was leading the charge at the start of the fight, had roughly 870 men. One officer survived. 107 enlisted men survived. If you were part of the 32nd Australian Battalion, you had maybe a 12-13% chance of coming out there alive. But we forget about it, because it wasn't Gallipoli. The Australian national identity is focused so obnoxiously heavily on Gallipoli that it disregards, and the central theme of this speech is the disregarding of the sacrifices of so many Australian soldiers for the glorification of so few others. And it's not the fault, of course, of any of the soldiers who served in the conflict. Very few of them have asked to be glorified. But we'll do it anyway, if you will. Now the generals, who supposedly led us so badly astray, get a bit of a bad rap. Everyone is a product of their time. There was a huge amount of incompetence in the general staffs of every nation in the war. Australia was no exception. Britain was definitely no exception. Germany was far, far worse in many regards than either nation, but we never hear about that because everyone loves to hate Haig. Now, Douglas Haig was a very imperfect man. There is no doubt. Some of the strategies he employed, the Battle of the Somme, of course, were horrific. But that was not necessarily his fault. He too was a product of his time. Military strategy takes time to adapt, and simply because somebody got it wrong and a huge number of people died as a result does not mean that we can ignore the reasons that they have made their mistake. An interesting tidbit, that between the hours of 5:30 and 11 a.m. on July 1st, 1916, the British Army suffered more casualties than Australia did during the Gallipoli campaign. That's an 8-month-long campaign. 60,000 British soldiers were dead or wounded by the end of July 1st, 1916, the beginning of the largest battle of the war, the Battle of the Somme. Okay. It might not actually even be the largest, but it was one of the 3 largest. Man shown here, Major General William Bridges, KCB, CMG, I forget what both of those words mean, but I was advised to include them. They are, of course, titles that are earned by prominent figures in the Commonwealth system.
Knight of the Bath and Cross of St Michael and St George.
Thank you.
It's also known as Call Me God. You have to be pretty damn spectacular to get CMG.
That's a beautiful word. Okay. Oh, beautiful title. Was the commander of the 1st Division of the Australian Imperial Force leading up to the Battle of Gallipoli. He had come across with it and been one of the chief organisers of the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. Unlike the fictional General Melchett, who sits in his chateau 150 miles from the front, drinking wine and pointing at arbitrary points on a map and telling soldiers to go die there, General William Bridges, patrolled the front line regularly during the early days of the Battle of Gallipoli until on the 15th of May he was killed while talking to his men. In fact, not killed, unfortunately. It would have been better for him had he been killed at the time. He was shot in the leg by a Turkish sniper while talking with a group of Australian privates. He was wounded, taken to a hospital ship, but had lost too much blood and they were unable to amputate his leg. Instead, he died of sepsis after 3 days, one of the most awful ways you can die. He's one of 2 Australians who died in the First World War who was buried in Australia. His burial is actually over at Adfa. I visited his grave because I walked my dog by there. Just an interesting tidbit. A lot of people might not think about it, but of course the other Australian buried in Australia from the First World War we'll never know, because he is of course the unknown soldier, buried in the tomb of the unknown soldier, making General Bridges the only Australian to be buried in Australia from the First World War. Now, as I touched on earlier, Douglas Haig was a product of his time, and the incessant, unkillable belief about the First World War was that it was a war of pointless frontal assaults and massive, wanton, needless slaughter. It's just not the reality of what strategy was like during that war. There were frontal assaults, and of course 1916 can quite readily be described as the year of frontal assault. There were a huge number of them in the preceding 2 years as well. However, the strategy of the war adapted because, funnily enough, generals were there to win the war, and they realised that frontal assaults were completely ineffective in wasting the lives of their men. The battles on the field of Passchendaele, or in the German spring offensives of 1917 and 1918, had nothing, or it bore almost no resemblance to the slaughter of the Somme in 1916. The strategies changed completely. Passchendaele didn't even have trenches. It was foxholes, mud, and pillboxes. Completely separate. Combined arms assaults of aircraft, tanks, and infantry were used during 1918 by Australian forces at the Battle of Hamel. It was the first time combined arms had ever been employed, and it was under one Australian general, Sir John Monash, who most of us have probably heard of, the university named after him. If you like. Now, the next myth that I discussed briefly is that Australian soldiers, aside from all their larrikinism and their casual disrespect for authority, were very elite soldiers. At the beginning of the war, it was completely untrue. Australian soldiers performed no noticeably better nor noticeably worse than anyone else. Now, there's this oft-talked-about idea of the universal soldier, where generally as the size of an army increases, the average skill of their soldiers tends to balance out. I don't go in for that. I think it's a very strange way of looking at things and pretty demonstrably untrue. However, at the start of the First World War, the Australian soldier or digger was very much the universal soldier, because he was very poorly trained, and he was certainly very poorly equipped. Your average Australian soldier had done mediocre bayonet drill. In Egypt, had done line fighting techniques, barely employed since the Boer War, where they were hilariously unsuccessful. It was obviously not the focus. People had begun to figure out about machine guns and cover and intelligent manoeuvring. These have been lessons learned very hard during the Franco-Prussian War. Gallipoli, to its eternal credit, does a really, really good job of showing this, because there's a scene where during a combat exercise in Egypt, where the Australian soldiers are practicing bayonet drill in a completely unrealistic manner. Everyone recognises that it's a completely useless drill. They're later fighting as enemy combatants in an exercise that people are taking so unseriously that the local Egyptian women are walking around selling oranges to the dead soldiers. That is in many ways quite realistic, because the training soldiers received at the time was completely insufficient. This is a picture of an Australian force deployed in, I believe, early August 1916. This is a picture of an Australian force, it's quite hard to see, unfortunately, in 1918 August, almost exactly 2 years later. If anyone can make that out clearly enough, what might stand out about those two things? If you can't make it out clearly enough, I'll be able to explain it. Helmets, yes.
Equipment. Trench.
Trench, yes, but that's probably just the location.
They're on salient.
So?
They're on salient. It's a much better design of trench, so rather than having brief cover, you've got...
A very good point. Yep, the trench system advanced hugely over the course of the war. One of the things that I would have liked to be able to show, however, due to the small size of the pictures, is very difficult to see, is the weapons. The Australian soldiers here in 1916 are equipped with their single-file Enfield rifle. The Australian soldiers on the right. Now, this might just look very unclear, but that's all heavy weapons. It's a great big stack of heavy weapons. There are 2 Lewis machine guns in there. There was a trench mortar and a couple of other heavy weapons. The idea is that by 1918, Australian soldiers were, in fact, almost the troops we're touted to have been the entire time, because we'd suffered a very large number of casualties, and that meant a huge amount of surplus equipment. The size of the average Australian platoon had dropped from its nominal full size of 33 men at the beginning of the Gallipoli campaign to give or take 20 men by the end of the war, rather. Which means you've got almost just over half the size of your original platoon. It also meant that by this point, because we'd been learning our lessons of the war, soldiers were no longer sent into battle with very low numbers of machine gun per battalion, very low numbers of any kind of heavy weapon whatsoever. Mortars, machine guns, everything was used. Flamethrowers, of course, as well, if you will. But you've also got the idea of the larrikin soldier with a heart of gold, which is perhaps the single most controversial idea in the ANZAC spirit. Because ultimately there is also nothing that sets Australians apart from anyone else in terms of the atrocities we committed. And it's something that we need to consider. There are a large number of photos from World War I of war crimes committed by German soldiers. There are exceptionally few of war crimes committed by Allied soldiers. It's largely because the Allies had a far, far more comprehensive set of photographs than the Germans did, and because we suppressed or burned a large number of photos of things that we didn't want to show, and we didn't take photos of most of the things we didn't want to show. The Australian war records for North Africa in World War I were accidentally burned to make way for the Australian war records for Africa in World War II. We still have copies of some of them, but as my old history teacher, Dr. Faraday, would be able to confirm, when he was doing his PhD thesis, he was a little upset to discover that we'd burnt most of our World War I records to make way for the World War II records, and in that disappeared innumerable accounts of Australian war crimes during not only the Gallipoli campaign, but the entire Egypt campaign, wherein we were fighting the Ottomans on the mainland Middle East. Now, I don't have any specific ones to share with you today. I do know plenty from, for instance, the Battle of Passchendaele, in which German soldiers holding pillboxes, as some of you who were talking with me earlier today would have heard. The Battle of Passchendaele, of course, in fact I'll share the anecdote. An Australian platoon forcing up, this is actually recorded by C.E.W. Bean, the official Australian war historian. A platoon of Australian soldiers during the Battle of Passchendaele was tasked with taking pillbox. Pillbox being large concrete blockhouses, large number of machine guns, rifle slits, very, very difficult to crack with artillery or direct assault. This group is tasked with attacking the pillbox and taking it. During the course of the assault, the platoon of about 25 men is reduced to an effective strength of 8. 10 men are killed, another 7 wounded. The 8 remaining soldiers make it to the rear of the pillbox where the entrance is, and the German forces, or the German soldiers inside, 8 men attempt to surrender. The first one opens the door with his hands up and is shot in the face. An Australian soldier throws a grenade into the pillbox and closes the door. The 7 German soldiers are obviously killed. Nobody minds. The Australian soldiers readily admitted it. They believed that the Germans had fought until there was nothing to save but their hides, and had only surrendered as cowards men. They didn't care about the fact that we have prisoner of war conventions. They didn't care about the fact that these German soldiers were acting well within their jobs as soldiers. They were prepared to kill because these German soldiers had killed their comrades. It's understandable, but it's reprehensible. But we don't want to acknowledge it, because we don't want to acknowledge that Australian soldiers can do wrong just like anything else, anyone else. The number of Japanese records going to World War II, as I'll show you in a minute, here we go, that indicate how many of their soldiers surrendered during the Kokoda campaign in 1942, shows that a much higher number of Japanese soldiers surrendered to Australian troops than the Australian records show surrendered to Australian troops, by about a factor of 3 to 1. And there is a very strong implication that, in fact, most of the Japanese forces who attempted to surrender to Australian troops were summarily executed, because we didn't want to deal with them. The Kokoda campaign was a campaign of severe logistical difficulty. It caused a lot of trouble to move prisoners of war back down your very, very stretched supply lines. So Australian forces, and of course the Japanese, were just as guilty of this, particularly as the campaign became more desperate for Japanese forces. But we executed POWs. We were quite prepared to. One account I've read by an Australian soldier discusses walking past the supply line, or walking up the Kokoda Trail towards the front line, and coming across a Japanese soldier who has been executed and then skinned and tied to a tree. Now, I can only hope that the man was executed and then skinned and not the other way around, but if you want to tell me that that is the sign of your honourable larrikin Australian soldier, you'd better do it with a straight face. Now, of course, this is not an example of the universal Australian soldier. I am not, obviously, attempting to imply that your average Australian soldier is the sort of monster who desecrates the dead of his foes. But we need to accept that bad, terrible things happen in war, and that we are as guilty of them as most people. The thing I really dislike about Gallipoli, as you might have noticed, is that it overshadows everything. Navy veteran James Brown, ex-captain I believe, recently, only a couple of months ago, published an excellent book which I advise that anyone who's got any interest in this topic read, called ANZAC's Long Shadow, The Cost of Our National Obsession. In this book he argues that Australia's jingoistic glorification of the ANZAC legend of Gallipoli is so harmful to modern Australian forces that it's causing us to disrespect the soldiers who are fighting and dying today. As I'll explain in a minute when I discuss a more personal account, there is a painful level of focus on Gallipoli that ignores the suffering and the memories of so many other people who have died on other fronts. I'd be interested to know how many people can actually name a large number of other battles from World War One. I've so far named Gallipoli, I've named Passchendaele, I've named Fromelles, and I've named the North Africa campaign. Does anyone want to put out another?
Flanders.
World War One.
Flanders wasn't us.
Somme even before.
Yep, Fromelles was part of the Battle of the Somme.
The Battle of the Bulge was bloody everyone.
Battle of the Bulge was 1944.
Yeah. See, no, but that's a wonderful example of just how poor it is.
Yeah.
That it gets mixed up in our history courses.
Yeah.
And I've stayed the fuck away from World War One because I didn't want to go anywhere near Gallipoli again.
Yeah.
It was such an appalling experience having this rammed down my throat in school that I didn't want to go near it.
That's fair enough.
Beersheba.
Sorry?
Beersheba. and
Beersheba
Gaza,
is, well,
Jerusalem.
Yep.
Haifa.
we had forces there, certainly. That's right. And in fact, you probably know more about the North African campaign than I do, because it's definitely not an area where even I would, well, I say even
I don't know that much.
if you will, that. However, for instance, the Battle of Bulcourt, which I can almost guarantee nobody here has ever heard of, was actually the single largest number of casualties that Australian forces have ever suffered inside of 24 hours. We lost 3,500 dead, and I doubt anyone in this room has ever heard of it. I visited Bulcourt. It's a tiny town in the middle of nowhere in the middle of France. There's a memorial there to the Australian soldiers, which is touching, but the fact that everyone here has completely forgotten the deaths of those men, even though in 24 hours we lost half as many men as we did in the Gallipoli campaign, is an insult to the families and the contributions, if you will. Even discussing it in this way is to almost a glorification of the war, but you understand my point. Battle of Dernancourt, which is about 45 miles southeast, I believe, of Bulcourt, which I've also visited. We lost 1,500 men in the course of about 48 hours. Nobody here has ever heard of it. The Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, at the very end of the German 1918 spring offensive on July 26th, in fact the second Battle of Villers-Bretonneux, I must say, April 26 to April 28, July 1918. Australian forces stood at the very crux, the furthest extent of the German advance, and I might add, with a very large contribution by British and French forces as well, because once again we mustn't forget the other people who fought, halted the German advance at its furthest extent. But no one's ever heard of it. Villers-Bretonneux certainly remembers Australia. In fact, there is a single school in Villers-Bretonneux, and it's a beautiful little school. Every classroom in Villers-Bretonneux is named after one of the big cities in Australia. There's a huge mural outside in the school courtyard that says, "Never forget Australia." But nobody in Australia has ever heard of Villers-Bretonneux. They don't care about the fact that a small town in France almost worships us. I've been there. I've sung there because I was part of a choir trip in 2007 and another in 2009, whose main task was to actually show that we sort of still remember that the Western Front exists. They haven't heard of us. We haven't heard of them. A large number of Australian soldiers died at Villers-Bretonneux. I lost my great-great-uncle at Villers-Bretonneux. Obviously there's no great emotional attachment because I'd never have heard of him if I hadn't studied it personally and discovered there were family links. But he died on April 27th there. I would bet quite strongly that most Australians have never heard of Dernancourt, Bulcourt, Villers-Bretonneux, and might even be pushing it for massive conflicts like Passchendaele. But we've all heard of Gallipoli, and we've all heard of Kokoda. There were other massive fights. The first Australian engagement of the war was actually in Papua New Guinea in 1941. Sorry, no, not 1941, in 1914. World War One. Did everyone know here that Papua New Guinea was actually a German colony?
Yes.
It was. Most people don't. Australian Imperial Forces deployed a battalion of troops to seize it. It wasn't a particularly bloody conflict. I think about 50 people died or something like that, but most people don't even know it existed. We controlled Papua New Guinea as a colony until the end of the Second World War. Well, I mean, obviously.
Considerably after that. We
Yes.
ended back under Gough Whitlam.
There we go, under Gough Whitlam. A lot of people don't seem to, realise that, because all we care about is Gallipoli, and if we're feeling really generous, Kokoda, and if we're feeling really generous, Tobruk. Australian forces did a heck of a lot more even in the Second World War than Kokoda and Tobruk. But I won't need to inundate everyone forever in stories like that, so I suppose we can move on. Now, this is how the ANZAC legend continues to frustrate and annoy those who lose people even today. Private Robert Pote was an Australian soldier and an old boy at Canberra Grammar School here in Canberra, who was killed in a green on blue attack on August 29, 2012. An Afghan soldier, presumably a member of an extremist group, opened fire and killed him and 2 other Australian soldiers while they were relaxing in an Australian base. Private Robert Pote was known to myself fairly personally and a few other people in this room, at least by name. And obviously his mourning was, well, it was considerable. There was a, I think, very touching funeral, which I believe most of us, or at least three of us here, attended in 2012. I had the, I think the word dubious honour is the best way of putting it, of being the head sacristan at that funeral at the time. I knew Robert pretty well. The media coverage that Robert Pote received after his death is best described as obnoxious. Robert Pote, according to Australian media, was a brave larrikin soul with a general disregard for authority but a heart of gold, who cared about mateship and who cared about all of the true ANZAC legends. These people have clearly never heard of, met or talked to anyone about Robert Pote. He is a cookie-cutter digger to make a headline. Robert Pote was a larrikin, there's no denying that. Absolutely not. The dude was, it was a bit of a tosser in a great kind of way. I say that in as an endearing way as you can.
He had a slightly rough sense of humour.
He really was a very lively soul. But to our media, the fact that a human being might actually have a personality seems a little bit unbelievable. So instead, what I heard about somebody I knew, Robert Pote, was that he was a cookie-cutter soldier from a legend that doesn't really exist, in a stereotype that's almost completely invalid from a war that's 100 years old. I don't think this is an appropriate way to treat the dead, the human beings, either of then or of now. It disregards the fact that there's a level of individuality to soldiers. People don't lose their identity when they go to war. They didn't back then and they certainly don't now. I don't really have a huge amount more to add. I'm very sorry this was actually a little darker than I thought it would be when I was preparing to present this. Wars do that. Thank you very much. If anyone has any questions, please do go ahead. I can talk about any number of potentially slightly happier things if you've got questions about them.
So, to raise the mood in a deeply tasteless way, if that would be appropriate.
Sorry, to raise the what?
Raise the mood in a deeply tasteless way, would that be appropriate or not?
Yeah, go ahead.
So you're saying that any humour here would be black, yet you're challenging us to be sassy?
Good start.
Well, since Mark's up front, someone needs to take his place out back. Well,
How would you prefer people portray the Australian soldiers?
It's an interesting question. I think it's a fair statement to say that the Australian media certainly does not have time to examine every soldier individually, because ultimately there's more to a news cycle than discussing in painful levels of depth what everyone was like. I don't expect history to be perfect. I expect history to make mistakes and to, certainly popular history, gloss over the realities of war in a number of ways. I don't want, and nobody should really want, our modern news media to be filled with stories of gore and atrocities by Australian soldiers. I think a level of realism also conveys a level of respect to those that not only died for us, but that we killed. That we acknowledge that our soldiers were not perfect. And my concern with the way that Australian soldiers over the last 2 decades have been presented is that we have moved from memorialising and remembrance of those who have fallen to glorification of them. And when you make the move from memory or remembrance to glorification, it's a step towards this sort of jingoistic nationalism that I really fear, and that I think a lot of people in the military really despise. My dad, who was in the military for a very, very long time, hates what ANZAC Day has become. He says the dawn service continues to be appropriate, usually touching. He loves, love is perhaps not the right word, but he deeply respects the fact that at 5:30 every evening as the war memorial closes, the personal story of an Australian soldier killed in any number of conflicts is told. I think that's a fantastic way to remember people. What I don't necessarily think is fantastic is saturation of our airwaves and our streets with sort of cheering young Australians, glorifying the fact that people have died in truly horrific conflict. I think it misses the point of what those conflicts are.
Also, while the news media perhaps doesn't have time to investigate every person individually, it would be nice if the politicians' speeches at the funerals of each dead soldier, because fortunately our casualties are so low that we can have our Prime Minister and usually our opposition leader attend every funeral, for which we should be eternally grateful that our casualties are so low. It would be nice if they could actually read out a script written by someone who knew the person rather than the list of ANZAC legend traits, which for me the irony of that was always brought home most potently at when one of the people who died in Afghanistan was from the Sniper Corps. The Sniper Corps is not noted for its larrikinism and disrespect of authority. It tends to be rather more disciplined and quiet because that's what you need a sniper to do.
The funeral of Robert Pope, one of the best decisions which the parents of Robert Pope made, was that they declined the offer by Australia's noble politicians to attend and speak at the funeral. Because they didn't actually much care about what Australians politicians who would never have cared about. Well, no offence is meant to the politicians of Australia. I do not mean to imply that they don't care about the soldiers who go off to war. I actually, despite my constant cynicism, have a fairly positive view of most of our politicians, and I do believe that they generally mean the best for their country and its citizens. But I don't necessarily think that they should be speaking at the funerals of dead soldiers, because they didn't, on a personal level, care about the person who died until they died. I don't think that's necessarily important, and neither did the parents of Robert Pope. And what that meant is that the funeral that was held was actually respectful and actually talking about the human being and not the image. Is there anything else, or shall I perhaps move on to something? Oh, go ahead.
I know very little about World War One, and if not for Gallipoli and stuff, then I'd probably know practically nothing about World War One. Do you think Gallipoli might be, even if they do oversimplify things and take kind of the wrong approach to it, is it better than nothing?
It's a difficult
awareness of history.
It's a really difficult question to answer, because, as you say, it's all well and good to complain about the little bit we do know, but without that little bit that we do know, we'd know pretty much literally nothing. My perhaps optimistic belief is that if we didn't focus so single-mindedly on Gallipoli and Kokoda, if we're feeling generous, we might actually examine other aspects of the war. There is the opportunity, and I think a good history program in school will examine some, again, this is only a discussion of military history. I'm also definitely not advocating the single-minded study of military history, because there's so much more to history. Military history is to history what Gallipoli is to military history. It's something important, but it's not too much more than a footnote. We have to look at a bigger picture. I think Gallipoli, done right, could serve as a great stepping point for Australians to learn about our military history. But the way it's being done at the moment is that Gallipoli is Australia's military history. We don't seem to care about it. Don't care about anything else.
Just as a comparison to a different country, because I didn't do the Australian education system,
Sure.
I'd say it's very comparable to France's idolisation of the resistance. They seem to... The idea that there were actually people who collaborated, they vaguely say, yes, they were collaborators, but they're not French people. There was maybe 2 or 3 of them in the country when the number of collaborators was so much greater than the resistance. While the resistance did some good things, it's basically credited with the entire war in the French education system, and it's a little ridiculous.
That one started, unfortunately, right at the beginning.
De Gaulle.
Yeah.
The statement made by de Gaulle when Paris was liberated by a French division which had broken formation and put the entire Allied strike through France at risk by doing so, to take Paris instead of holding where it was meant to, was that France is liberated for the French by the French. Which is partially true. The French did take Paris. It's just in the same way that we like to forget that France or Britain, anyone but Australia, New Zealand and the Ottomans, or Gallipoli, they seem to sort of like to forget that there was anyone else in France. It's an unfair view, of course. It's a generalisation. And to say that the French don't know that other people were in World War II is to say that Australians don't know that there were other people in World War II. It's a blatant untruth, but it's far too prevalent.
On your point about Gallipoli being perhaps better than nothing, I would agree with Mark that if not for Gallipoli, it's not Gallipoli or nothing, it's Gallipoli or a much better picture of the war, and that fits into a lot of criticisms that I've articulated to several people about what I feel of the education system. But on Gallipoli itself, By the time I'd finished primary school, I'd seen Gallipoli 4 times. Not one of them was at home, and not one of them had I enjoyed. Because it was always shown at school in an environment where you're all crammed into a hall sometime around about Australia Day to watch this great, reverential, magical, totally true movie. The one other piece of history that we looked at was the First Fleet, where naturally everyone was great and wonderful and a Cockney with a gloriously cliched Dick Van Dyke-esque accent.
One of the areas I think I'm actually a little worried. I had a pretty decent education of the First Fleet. There was a great deal about massacres, there was a great deal about the severe mistreatment of convicts, about starvation, and the Second Fleet, of course, was a hell of a lot worse for convicts. Half the convicts who arrived in the Second Fleet were dead on arrival. But we won't go into that because obviously it's a completely different topic. Do we have any other questions?
I was just wondering what your thoughts were in terms of, so like we're about to have like a really big Gallipoli sort of moral thing, and it's going to be awful news-wise, media-wise. The fact that at the same time it's coming up to the anniversary of the Armenian genocide, in which over a million Armenians were killed. I think I can't remember. And that Australia refuses to acknowledge that as an actual occurrence because that would jeopardise our access to Gallipoli, a site that is venerated.
The coin I'm holding in my hand at the moment reads, 100 years of ANZAC, the spirit lives, $1, 2014 to 2018. This, I don't actually really mind a coin commemorating, that's not too bad. But I think it's the beginning of what's going to be an unbearably saturated news cycle.
For the next 4 fucking years.
I believe that the centenary of what I would be tempted to call the second greatest conflict in human history is something that we definitely need to remember and something that we definitely need to pay attention to. But I don't think it excuses... The best way to put it is misjudgment. The most realistic way to put it is blatant mistruths of the greatest order. And I'm consistently infuriated by the bipartisan failure of the Australian government, regardless of who is in power, to acknowledge that 1 million innocent people were killed simply because the enemy we fought at the time is now good buds with us, and we care so much about Gallipoli that we're prepared to overlook a genocide. The second, in fact not second, but one of the greatest genocides, were it only one of 2, I'd feel a lot happier. But one of the most horrific genocides of the 20th century. But we don't want to do it because, as you say, it would jeopardise relations with the Turkish government. And we can't have that because Gallipoli is really important. And
so important that we did actually jeopardise relations with them when the Howard government wrote to the Turkish government and said, how dare you build a road through one of our most sacred sites? Why the hell did you do it? And the Turkish government said, because you wrote to us in this letter and blah, 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 asking us to
improve access to the site.
It's interesting, I guess.
It's one of the few issues we are prepared to.
Since the 1980s, attendance in remembrance ceremonies in Australia has been on precipitous rise since the late 1980s, and my dad. My dad was in the military during 1979, the year after he signed up. People threw fruit at a remembrance ceremony. There was still a little bit of bad blood after the Vietnam War. Some returning veterans from the Vietnam War had cheeks blood poured on them. So obviously I don't think that's particularly acceptable either, but the numbers of people attending Gallipoli, the dawn ceremony, Gallipoli every year, almost exclusively Australians obviously, but with a very, very high portion of Australians, has become so overcrowded now that you can often be as far as 5 kilometres away from the actual podium.
They held a ballot to figure out who could get there.
Yeah, you have to win a ballot to get there.
That's pretty standard, yeah.
No, they've already held it. They've held the ballot. All the seats are allocated.
For the next 4 years?
For
or just
next year, I
It's
think.
for the last one that they've done. I'm not sure
Yeah,
if they've
it's a
done
big
the
one.
next one yet.
For next year, it's all allocated already. Yes, it's quite...
I'm totally
tasteless.
cool with them holding a ballot. I think that's a great idea because it prevents overcrowding and further damage to the site, which, I might add, has already been really badly degraded by constant spam of tourists.
Incidentally,
Yeah.
the site where it's now held is actually about 100 metres inland
Yeah.
from the site where it is notionally commemorating, because firstly, coastal erosion happens. Secondly, you can't fit more than about 30 people at the site of the landing it's trying to commemorate, so they shifted it a
Explains
good...
a lot about it.
Yeah, so they shifted it a good deal inland so that you can fit a couple of thousand people. If you could fit that many thousand people on that beach, it would have been taken in about half a day.
We found a way to fit 2,500 Australian corpses on the beach by the end of the first day of landings.
Well, they were stacking them on top of each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's easier
That's
to
about
do
right.
it with dead people than living ones.
Okay, Grisham?
As a slight aside, I guess, do you know if Turkey has the same kind of Gallipoli obsession as Australia does? Because the Turkish commander at Gallipoli was, or one of them,
Kemal
was Ataturk. And like, if you know anything about Turkish history in the period, it's that Turkish people fucking love Ataturk. So do you know if Turkey has the same kind of fetish, given that they won?
Fetishism.
No, fetish is the right word.
Very much the right word. Kemal Ataturk. There are laws preventing the slander of Kemal Ataturk. We ignore the fact that Kemal Ataturk was well and truly responsible for the massacring of 10,000 Armenians during the First World War. Because we don't like that, and Australia in particular ignores it because we're one of the few Western nations remaining that refuses to acknowledge the existence of the Armenian genocide, and I'll actually get to your question as well. Interestingly, Germany keeps getting annoyed at Australia because we continue to refuse acknowledging the Armenian genocide. If there's one thing Germany has gotten very good at over the last 5 decades, it's acknowledging war crimes. So some people know that came out.
On the point of people knowing about Gallipoli, I have a German friend who I actually asked him at one point if he had heard of Gallipoli. He said no.
Yeah.
And that he'd done a huge amount of history, and they rammed a lot of the World War I, World War II stuff down their throat for the entirety of the history course.
Yeah.
And he'd never heard of Gallipoli.
It was strategically not important.
I do actually have a German history book written in the just after the First World War about Gallipoli, but they don't mention the Australians at all, really.
I'll try and just answer Grish's question before we go on. Which is that there is a considerable amount of attention paid to Gallipoli in Turkey. I don't think it's as focused. It is used, I think, quite intelligently as a great way to build diplomatic relations with Turkey. Sorry, with Australia, which is important because the Turkish government at the moment is pretty lacking in legitimacy. In fact, the Turkish government pretty much eternally has been pretty lacking in legitimacy. So having a Western nation that is not lacking in legitimacy, that wants to be best buds with it, and is perfectly happy to ignore war crimes and genocide and a large, long list of serious shortcomings, is really good for Turkish legitimacy. So the answer is yes, there's a lot of attention paid to it, but it's certainly not to the same extent as it is in Australia.
There are
If you want-
things in Turkish nationalism
I
that
think,
happened around about
was-
1918 to 1925.
Yeah. Was Fiona next?
Yeah.
Or,
Hannah's had her hand up for
Hannah?
ages.
Sorry.
Yeah. As you already know, I grew up in different international schools in different parts of the world, and I had like an American and many other different cultural, raising things, curriculums, and in almost every single place, including the Australian international school I went to, because there was only 3 Australians in the Australian international school, on ANZAC Day, what happened was, with no prior warning, they chucked us in whatever you call it, the multi-court, the auditorium, the place where you have the big school meetings. They would get me up on the podium and say the poem. I can't remember the title of the poem.
That's fine.
In Flanders Fields.
Yes. And then people would get up and there would be normally 10th graders who would come up and write as if they were soldiers in the war, and they would say, oh yes, this horrible thing happened to me, but they didn't do any research. They were literally writing creative writing about what they thought being in a war was like. And most of them thought the worst pain would be in marching. They did not think of any of the, I know it's a large part of it, but not about the environment or anything, or any of the horrors of the friends dying. But they were raised, in every school I went to, all the Australian students stood at the front and proclaimed to the whole school, our people are amazing soldiers and they died for this, and pretty much our soldiers are better than your soldiers.
We laugh, but it's a huge problem.
I know,
But the thing is, I was always the one on the podium reading that poem. I wanted to say, we may have been one side of the war, but there was another side of the war. Everyone just that died was a human. But every time they wanted me on that podium, they would never allow me to say, everyone that died in this war is a human with a family, and everyone should be respected because they fought in this war.
Has anyone ever stopped to think about the words to In Flanders Field? We are the dead, short days ago we lived, saw, I believe, dawn, saw sunsets glow. We loved and well loved, and now we lie in Flanders Field. Take up our quarrel with the foe.
Yeah.
For to you with failing hands we throw, the torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with those who die, we shall not rest though poppies grow in Flanders Field. This is not a song about, a poem about making peace or remembrance. This is a poem about continuing the fight. That's exactly what it's about. It's a nationalistic poem. It's a jingoistic poem. I'm amazed, consistently amazed, that this is a poem that we use to remember it, because it's the exact opposite theme of what remembrance is about. It's about continuing the fight. It's not about remembrance, it's about vengeance.
Yeah, but how many people actually stop and listen to the poem being read? Most people would just like go straight over their head because they just want to get through whatever the assembly they're in.
The other thing is that the way that's spun, that has actually been recognised by a lot of people running those organisations, running those events, and by teaching, because they draw out those lines and they explicitly say, by the way, this isn't about violence, this is about take up our spirit, keep on with our spirit of freedom, which is utter bullshit. But out of curiosity, were we even at Flanders?
Flanders refers to the same fields of Passchendaele in 1917.
Okay, put it like this. We're obviously going on what you've been saying. It's all been about tradition and everything. So if we take out that poem, what are we going to replace it with? And everyone's going to whinge and complain about it being taken out.
I presumed you would be better.
I think I love
Less
Australian
about
war
the
poetry.
poem.
If I'd actually read any of my war poems in about 4 or 5 months now, I might have been able to recite in Flanders Fields without making any stumbles. It is a beautiful poem, but it's not a nice poem, and there are probably, in fact, there are very few nice war poems from the First World War. I can't think why. But Flanders Fields, there are other options, and there are certainly other ways. There is nothing that states that we must always say in Flanders Fields. I think the last post and the review are a beautiful way to show remembrance. But I don't think in Flanders Fields is. This is not like taking the Lord's Prayer out of the Catholic Church. This is not a tradition that we built on for 2,000 years. Even if it were, a tradition does not necessarily mean a good thing in of itself. There's got to be a reason.
Wouldn't you argue that the longer it's actually in, the harder it's going to be to eventually pull it out?
Well,
It's
absolutely.
True. Absolutely. But that doesn't mean that it should stay for its own sake. I mean, obviously, difficulty in the realism or the practicality of taking something out. I mean, I can't imagine the shitstorm would create if we actually tried to pull in Flanders Fields from our memorials, but geez, I think we should.
For me, a lot of this comes from not usually the defence. As you said, most soldiers have a reasonable idea of what a soldier is, funnily enough, and have very different ideas on what they'd like to see done on Remembrance Day. But it's often the groups around the edges. Most properly trained historians in Australia have a reasonable idea of how pathetic and small and off to the side Gallipoli was, and the extent to which, as casualty counts go for Australia, it was tiny. It's the people around the edges. So amateur historians in Australia often tend to pick up a couple of themes and explore along those themes in very simplistic lines, and then publish these gloriously well-written books that trumpet their nationalistic praise. And then you get organisations, one of whom that I have a personal hatred for is the Australian Defence Association, which is not actually part of the Defence Force, but takes on itself the role of lobbyist and jumps down the throat of anyone who criticises any Australian soldier living or dead. And frequently anyone who criticises any Australian war, current or past. And that creates an environment in which you're not allowed to dissent. So this very dark story, there are much lighter stories from World War I. Not an enormous number, but there are some. And it was not exclusively relentless doom. There are definitely other stories to explore in World War One. Interestingly, you can study World War One without military history. Funny but true.
That's fascinating.
But the reason why, when you're trying to talk about everything else, you have to start with this really heavy pushback of doom and gloom, just to break people out of the mold that they get indoctrinated in, whatever country you're in. Of, here is our great triumphant battle that we love and that we tell every time. It's quite annoying.
Germany.
Or Russia, because there are other things happening in Russia
One
between
of
the
the
years
things-
1914 and 1918.
One of the things that amazed me is I spent
Took Germany a long time
I
to
spent
get
a
to
month
that
and a
position.
half.
Yes, but currently they spend the entire history course going, we fucked up, this is how we fucked
And
up.
it's true, and I
we
love
did really bad things.
because I-
which is very true, but
Yeah,
it
I
doesn't
spent-
have that glorification that we
I
have
spent a
now.
month and a half in Germany at the beginning of the year, living with a host family in Bonn while I studied to improve my German, which was great. And talking to the host family, they had the frankest, most appreciable assessment of any sort of random Joe I've ever had. I mean, they weren't historians, and they didn't know exceptional amounts about either war, because the average person being able to name the Battle of Bullecourt or Dernancourt or Fromelles is not actually really important. I mean, it's pub trivia for a lot of people. But these people, this family, were completely understanding of the reality of what soldiers actually do in a war, which is fight and die and do the wrong thing. As I stated earlier today during the discussion on ethics, that in war, ethics is actually the first casualty, not truth. Truth comes very, very quickly afterwards. But things go wrong very quickly in war, and people do the wrong thing very quickly in war. I would be quite prepared to bet that even today it would not at all be uncommon for instance, militants captured by Western soldiers and who have been injured to be executed. Under basically every international convention that's like still made illegal. But I somehow doubt it stops Western forces, let alone the sort of brutal pictures that are coming out of Iraq at the moment, because the Islamic State is exceptionally good at its online media campaign, which means we've got huge numbers of pictures of truly horrific acts getting around on the internet being put up by these Muslim extremists. Anyway, Fiona, did you still have a question?
Yeah, I may be the only person here that hasn't seen Gallipoli.
I haven't
You
seen that.
lucky person.
I did a really bad job of explaining that, and for that I apologise. I sort of launched straight away.
Because it seems like you've seen it a lot in schools.
So, yeah.
I
Good.
never got shown it in
Okay,
school.
yeah.
Never.
I got shown
So
it
is it,
on.
despite the flaws, is it worth watching?
No.
As
Oh, no, I think it is what
It's valid. It's good.
Yeah.
Are there any other?
It's a good
things-
movie.
Yeah,
Are there
it's a
any
nice
other
yarn.
sources that would be good sort of
Well, I was talking.
introductions to?
Mark, take a step that way.
Sorry. Oh, yes, sorry. This is just the bibliography. These are almost entirely just sources for the photos that I had, I'm afraid. If you'd like more stuff on where I've done my reading, you're perfectly welcome to ask me afterwards, because I'm aware that as like an introductory talk this is alright, but I haven't exactly shown my proofing, so to speak.
Where is it? Where are we? Sorry, I'm trying to find the book. There we go.
ANZAC's Long Shadow by James Brown is, I mean, it's probably not a great introductory read because it's got a fair bit of assumed knowledge, but it is a fantastic book for anyone who's interested. To answer your question, Gallipoli is absolutely worth at least one watch. By the fifth time, it starts to get a little boring. Now, this is coming from somebody who, inside of 2 weeks, watched How to Train Your Dragon 2 6 times. I have got a lot of patience for films. Gallipoli was really, really damn boring by the fifth time, but I watched it 5 times in 3 years. That's not, like, too bad. But at least once, I think it's a pretty legitimate, it's got a lot of myths because it, emphasises that the average Australian soldier came from a rural community and stuff like that. It's just not true. Almost all our soldiers came from major urban centres, but
It's because
it's
most of the
good.
population is.
And to actually explain the plot of Gallipoli, as I should, it's the story of a man named Archie, and I forget his last name, and his best friend, whose name I forget completely. I'm sorry.
His
It was mate.
Okay.
Mate.
Yeah, his name's Mate.
I watched it like 2 days ago, but I'm afraid up on stage. I
The
forgot.
blonde one and the black head one.
Blondie and black hair, yeah.
Does
Who-
have a donkey as well? Or is
That's
that
Simpson and his donkey, that's a complete shit. Interestingly,
Which is also
Simpson
good.
and his donkey is also one of our favourite war myths. The dude existed, and he was certainly a good man, and there was probably a donkey involved in his saving lives. Probably, we can't be certain of that. But he was credited within his 2-week lifespan at Gallipoli having saved more than 300 Australian lives, bringing them back down to the shores. If he were working 24 hours a day with a high-speed donkey, he would have been able to move 300 people. The reality is that he's almost certainly still a war hero, and we need to respect that. But by making up facts and figures, I don't think we're respecting anyone. Anyway, to answer your question, Gallipoli is the story of Blondie and Blackhair, who are 2 rural Australians who sign up for the Australian Imperial Force with the 10th Light Horse Brigade. They go over to Egypt. They train in Egypt very effectively, and then, because the Gallipoli campaign is organised, leave their horses behind and go over to fight as infantry in Gallipoli.
The loss of the horses is a very touching moment.
Gallipoli is
Don't joke
not
about
particularly great. Oh, I might add, sorry. Both Archie and his friend are champion runners, I might add. Archie better than Blackhair. But,
Yes, much.
But they fight at Gallipoli for quite some time, and at the climax of the film, the 2 of them are fighting at the Battle of the Neck, the one I mentioned earlier, where 200 Australians die in an area the size of a tennis court. And there's a very, very, very touching scene in which Blackhair and Archie are up at the front line. Due to a miscoordination, the artillery bombardment that's meant to be covering the assault of the Australian forces stops 7 minutes early, meaning that they're going to be attacking into Turkish troops who are completely prepared for them and know that they're coming. So Archie's friend is sprinting down to command to try to tell them to stop in time, does not get there in time. Archie and everyone else goes over the top. If you could jump back to the other scene. And the movie freezes on this pose here, which is one of the more famous pictures in Australian cinematographic history. Archie obviously is extremely unwell in that picture. He is in the process of becoming even less well.
This is mid-machine gun.
Yeah. It is a very good movie, but it's not. I mean, it's
a movie.
It's a good historical movie in the same way that Saving Private Ryan, I think, does a pretty decent job of showing the state of the D-Day landings. There's a lot of historical inaccuracy, but on the whole, it gets the picture, and I don't think that's an inherently bad thing, because whereas I expect our media to be kind of on the ball, movies
Unlike Breaking Around.
Unlike Breaking Around. Can I just finishing off with 2 things. The first is about breaking Around, and the second is because I did think to have something vaguely light-hearted to end this on.
Just no.
Breaking Around is, of course, does everyone here know the story of Breaking Around?
No.
Breaking Around was an Australian soldier, or I forget his actual name, but his nickname was Breaker and his last name was Around. There's an Australian soldier in the Boer War who, arguably under the command of one of his superior officers, executed a number of Boer prisoners.
Including civilians.
Including civilians.
And German press.
Yeah, it was something like 18 to 23 people, I forget how many. And there's now a very good play getting around about Breaking Around, set with Breaking Around, and one of his best mates is the protagonist. He went through a long struggle in which he had been accused of executing these prisoners unlawfully, even though he was ordered to do so by his commander, and is eventually tried, found guilty, and executed. He became famous for his last words, "Shoot straight, you bastards, and don't make a mess of it." Now, that is a really great play, but if I was just following orders is not good enough for the SS guards at Auschwitz for murdering innocent civilians, I don't think it's good enough for Australian soldiers either. So sorry, Mr. Morant, but you died just like you really should
Historically on that one though, the line "I was just following orders" is one that if you're going to look into history, you have to be much more willing to take seriously, because it gets a really bad rap in modern society, precisely because of the Holocaust.
Yeah. Now, World War II was a watershed for the...
It changes an enormous amount of stuff. In World War I, if your commanding officer told you to shoot prisoners and you didn't, you could be shot for disobeying orders. We only really get war crimes as an explicit thing from 1945 onwards. So, that's one thing you have to understand about the Breaking Morant thing. It's not that he shot the prisoners. It's that he shot them unlawfully. And his defence is not, "I didn't shoot them," it's, "I was following orders." And the military court accepts that if he were following orders, that would be a perfectly legitimate reason to shoot the prisoners. It would be reason to try his commander for ordering this, but he would be absolved.
It's kind of important to note that the line "I was just following orders" is not an admissible defense for war crimes. For a lot of other things, it's an admissible defense.
Yes.
For a lot, like if you shoot civilians who say I was just following orders, then it's not a defense.
Yes.
But
Nowadays,
like if you
that's absolutely true.
accidentally like fire a artillery on
A UN
a UN school or something like that, and your line was these are the coordinates I was ordered to fire on.
I can't see it. I'm shooting from
Yeah,
both
so
of
you
the
can't
horizons.
have people constantly contesting your
That's
orders.
it. It's the difference between being told to shoot at grid coordinates and being told to shell a UN school with white phosphorus.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
obviously say no to shelling a UN school with white phosphorus. You may shell your grid coordinates as you're expected to.
But again, that's now.
Yeah.
And personally, I think that's good. The stopping of war crimes is probably a desirable event. If you're going to look into the history of this sort of stuff, though, you have to take seriously that this was a totally different culture in which, until at least the end of World War I, people could make a very good argument and a very culturally reasonable argument that you were supposed to follow the orders rather than follow your conscience. It gets mucky in World War I because you've got a lot more people involved from different cultural backgrounds. It starts getting mixed up. And by the end of World War II, it's no longer acceptable. Before that, though, you're expected to follow the orders.
A lot of that is because.
But he didn't actually follow the orders.
No,
There were no
he didn't.
orders.
Yeah,
The
no,
court
there
found there were no orders.
Yes.
The
So-
reason people make this argument in Australia is because he's a national hero.
Yes.
So much so that we're about to build on ANZAC Parade a memorial to people like him.
Yeah.
Who executed
He's to this day, he is in the entire history of the British Empire, he is the only convicted and executed war criminal from the British Empire.
I'd
side of
argue that
things.
that's probably more the failure of the British Empire.
It's true, but he still has that thing of the only one who was convicted,
Now there's
and
a
he is
dubious
one of
honour.
the major national heroes in Australia.
His
It's
sole
a really
claim-
hagiographic
His
film.
sole claim to fame is that he
Absolutely.
killed a number of innocent civilians, was found guilty of it, and executed.
Yes. And
The reason
one line.
And he had a very cool
He had a very good one-liner, and perhaps the real reason he got executed, unlike a lot of other Australians who were doing the same thing, is he just happened to do it just after the German public got really interested in helping their Dutch friends who the British were trying to invade in South Africa. So there was a chance of a war between Britain and Germany, so there was some real politics there as well. But the bottom line is they still did what got the German public really angry, and the British court was able to convict. And the weird thing is, and you will get massive arguments in just about any pub in Australia over this issue because he's a national hero. He's totally untouchable.
The Australians quite bizarre. Yeah, it's just really interesting.
Really hagiographic film.
There's an interesting anecdote that I'll move on to just before. Sorry, just
Yeah.
yeah, and then I'll actually get on to the thing I'm meant to be ending on.
That's how
In World War II, we accidentally sort of made a mistake when we tried and executed a Japanese general. I say we, I mean the Allies at the Tokyo war crime trials, wherein we accidentally sort of created a precedent by which every military officer alive needed to be executed. Because this general had been, during the Philippine campaign in 1944, as the Japanese were being forced out of the Philippines, I've forgotten his name unfortunately.
Archer, I think.
I don't know, but had given orders for Japanese troops to pull out of Manila, where they had been garrisoned and were busy committing really, really terrible atrocities. He had been cut off, more or less, from those Japanese forces, and had issued every order under his power to get them out of there because they were meant to be retreating and not raping, looting and pillaging. Following the rape, looting and pillaging of Manila and the subsequent complete destruction of that Japanese force and the capturing of this general, he was placed on trial at the end of the war for the crime of his division raping, looting and pillaging Manila. His defence was, I ordered them to leave. I had given them express orders to be not there and not raping or looting and pillaging, but he was found guilty anyway because the crimes of his subordinates were judged to be his crimes. He was expected to have gotten onto a horse and physically ridden there to drag them out one by one if he had to in order to prevent their crimes. It was just his responsibility to stop them. But what that means is that if an Australian soldier shoots a Turkish prisoner in Gallipoli, Douglas Haig needs to be executed for it.
The Queen.
The Queen herself. You're quite right. Because frankly, yeah.
Wasn't it King at that time?
The
Yes,
King.
it was.
Yes,
But
that
If
was-
it happened today in Afghanistan, it would be the Queen.
because the head of state is not there
I'm-
dragging
I'm
that soldier
sorry.
away from his gun. He's not doing
And
his
the
duty.
king's not around anymore, so we've got to go after the queen
Anyway,
now.
we never issued an apology.
The Governor
but
General?
We never did issue an apology for that one, but
Yes.
we did subsequently
Now
decide.
we've
No, he
changed
has no
GG.
strict military command.
Yeah, no, I'm happy. We've changed GG, so I'm
It's-
I'm happy with it.
Oh no, I have a lot of respect for Cosgrove. He tried to do some very good
Alright.
things and he didn't entirely.
Anyway,
Moving on.
high note.
Yes. The final note, because this is beginning to really drag on, and I'm sorry about that, is
Something so interesting.
yeah. My great-great-grandfather was gassed at the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. He breathed in mustard gas and received very severe burns to his skin and his lungs,
Only for a light note.
and was left blinded for about 6 months. But he did recover. While he was busy recovering, he was on a hospital ship where he met and fell in love with a nurse. They came back to Australia, settled here, and eventually had kids.
That's borderline cliche.
But it's cute anyway.
Hooray.
Anyway, thank you very much.